Maria Santos had been living a double life for 3 years. To her neighbors in the small town of Riverside, she was just another mechanic at the local airfield, always covered in grease and oil stains, fixing engines and patching up old aircraft. Her calloused hands and dirt-stained overalls made her blend perfectly into the background of what most people considered a man's world. Every morning she would tie her long black hair into a tight bun, pull on her work boots, and head to the hangar where she spent her days maintaining the fleet of training planes used by the nearby military academy. But what nobody knew was that Maria had been flying since she was 16 years old. Her father, a former Air Force pilot himself, had taught her everything he knew about aviation before his death in a car accident 5 years earlier. He had always believed that flying was in her blood, and he was right. Maria could read the Sky Like Others read books, understanding wind patterns, weather changes, and aircraft behavior with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. She had logged over 2,000 flight hours in secret, sneaking out at dawn or staying late after work to practice in the older planes that nobody paid much attention to. The year was 1943, and the world was engulfed in the chaos of the Second World War. Women weren't allowed to serve as combat pilots in the military, no matter how skilled they were. Maria had applied multiple times to join the Women Air Force Service Pilots program, but each application had been rejected due to bureaucratic complications and her lack of formal flight training credentials. The irony wasn't lost on her that she could probably outfly half the men at the academy, yet she was stuck on the ground because of outdated rules and prejudices. During her lunch breaks, Maria would often climb to the roof of the main hangar and watch the student pilots practice their maneuvers. She could spot their mistakes from miles away: a turn too sharp, an approach too steep, a landing that would make any experienced pilot cringe. Sometimes she wanted to shout corrections, but she knew it would only draw unwanted attention to herself. Instead, she would mentally note their errors and imagine how she would handle each situation differently. The other mechanics respected Maria's work, but never suspected the depth of her aviation knowledge. When they talked about engine troubles or flight dynamics, she would offer subtle suggestions that always seemed to solve the problems, but she was careful never to reveal too much of what she really knew. Her supervisor, Tom Richardson, often praised her mechanical skills but would laugh whenever someone jokingly suggested she should try flying. "Maria's got her feet firmly planted on the ground," he would say, completely unaware that she had already mastered aerial combat techniques that most military pilots only dreamed of learning. Late at night, when the airfield was deserted, Maria would sometimes sit in the cockpit of her favorite plane, a modified P-51 Mustang that had been retired from active service. She would run through combat scenarios in her mind, practicing quick decision-making and strategic thinking. Her father had taught her that the best pilots weren't just skilled at flying, they were tacticians who could think 3 moves ahead of their enemies. Maria had spent years developing this mental agility, studying historical air battles and analyzing the strategies that led to victory or defeat. The war seemed distant from their small town, but Maria knew it was only a matter of time before it would touch their lives directly. Radio broadcasts brought news of air battles over Europe and the Pacific, and she would listen intently, absorbing every detail about fighter tactics and enemy capabilities. She had memorized the specifications of German Messerschmitt fighters, Japanese Zeros, and American aircraft, understanding their strengths and weaknesses better than most active military pilots. What Maria didn't know was that her secret flying sessions hadn't gone completely unnoticed. Colonel James Mitchell, the Academy's commanding officer, had occasionally spotted an unauthorized aircraft in the early morning sky, performing maneuvers that were far too advanced for any of his student pilots. He had been trying to identify the mystery pilot for months, but whoever it was seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. The colonel was impressed by what he witnessed: precision flying that reminded him of veteran combat pilots he had served with in the Great War. As Maria walked home that evening, she had no idea that her hidden talents would soon be put to the ultimate test. The enemy was closer than anyone realized, and her small town was about to become the front line of a battle that would change everything. The young woman who had spent 3 years disguising her true abilities was about to discover that sometimes destiny has a way of revealing our deepest secrets when the stakes couldn't be higher. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Maria reached her small apartment, but something felt different in the air. There was a tension she couldn't quite identify, like the calm before a storm. As she prepared for what she thought would be just another ordinary evening, she had no way of knowing that tomorrow would bring an attack that would force her to choose between maintaining her secret identity and using her skills to save countless lives. The hidden pilot was about to become a hero, whether she was ready for it or not. The morning of October 15th started like any other day at Riverside Airfield, but the tranquility was shattered at exactly 8:47 a.m. when the first wave of enemy aircraft appeared on the horizon. Maria was underneath a training plane, tightening bolts on the landing gear, when she heard the distinctive whine of aircraft engines approaching at high speed. At first, she assumed it was just another routine training exercise, but something about the sound made her pause and listen more carefully. The engines had a different pitch than the American aircraft she was familiar with, sharper, more aggressive, with a metallic quality that made her blood run cold. She rolled out from under the plane and squinted into the bright morning sky, where she could make out a formation of 12 aircraft approaching from the east. Even from a distance, she could tell these weren't friendly planes. The sleek profiles and distinctive wing configurations were unmistakably German Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters, somehow operating far from any known theater of war. Chaos erupted across the airfield as air raid sirens began wailing and personnel scrambled for cover. Maria watched in horror as the first wave of enemy fighters dove toward the runway, their machine guns chattering as they strafed everything in sight. Explosions bloomed across the tarmac as fuel trucks and parked aircraft burst into flames. The acrid smell of burning aviation fuel filled the air, and the peaceful morning was transformed into a nightmare of destruction and terror. Colonel Mitchell's voice crackled over the airfield's public address system, barely audible above the roar of engines and explosions. He was ordering all non-essential personnel to evacuate immediately, while calling for any available pilots to man the few combat-ready aircraft that remained undamaged. But most of the Academy's instructors were either off-duty or trapped in buildings that were now under direct attack. The student pilots, though brave, lacked the experience needed to face seasoned enemy aviators in aerial combat. Maria crouched behind a fuel barrel, her mind racing as she assessed the situation. She counted at least 12 enemy aircraft, and they were systematically destroying everything of military value on the airfield. The attackers were clearly professional pilots, executing coordinated attack patterns with deadly precision. She watched as they reformed for a second pass, and she realized with growing dread that this wasn't just a hit-and-run raid. They were planning to completely eliminate the airfield's capacity to launch any kind of defense. The sound of approaching footsteps made her turn, and she saw Tom Richardson running toward her, his face pale with fear and confusion. "Maria, we need to get out of here," he shouted over the noise. "The colonel says enemy submarines must have launched these planes from somewhere off the coast. This is a full-scale attack." Maria nodded, but her attention was fixed on something else. 3 American P-51 Mustangs sitting in a reinforced hangar that had so far been spared from the bombing. As the second wave of enemy fighters screamed overhead, Maria made a decision that would change everything. She had spent 3 years hiding her abilities, but she couldn't stand by and watch while her country was under attack. The planes in that hangar represented the airfield's only hope of mounting any kind of defense, and she was probably the only person present who had the skills necessary to use them effectively. "Tom, I need you to do something for me," she said, gripping his arm firmly. "Get to the radio room and contact the nearest military base. Tell them we're under attack and request immediate air support. Can you do that?" Tom nodded frantically and ran toward the communications building, dodging debris and bullet fragments as he went. Maria waited until he was out of sight, then sprinted toward the hangar where the Mustangs were housed. The hangar doors were partially damaged but still functional. Maria yanked them open and was relieved to find all 3 aircraft appeared to be in flyable condition. She had maintained these particular planes herself over the past 6 months, and she knew every inch of their mechanical systems. The fuel tanks were full, the ammunition was loaded, and the engines had been serviced just 2 days earlier. Everything she needed for combat was right there waiting for her. As she climbed into the cockpit of the first Mustang, Maria's hands moved automatically. Through the pre-flight sequence she had practiced hundreds of times in secret. The familiar controls felt like extensions of her own body, and despite the chaos raging outside, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was what she had been training for her entire life, even if she hadn't known it at the time. The engine roared to life with a satisfying growl, and Maria taxied the aircraft toward the runway. She could see the enemy formation regrouping for another attack run, and she knew she had perhaps 2 minutes before they would be back. As she reached the end of the runway, she took one last look at the burning airfield around her. In a few moments, everyone would know her secret, but that no longer mattered. All that mattered now was stopping the enemy before they could complete their mission of destruction. Maria pushed the throttle forward and felt the Mustang surge down the runway. As the plane lifted into the sky, she transformed from a hidden mechanic into a combat pilot, ready to face 12 experienced enemy aviators in what would become one of the most remarkable air battles of the entire war. The young woman who had spent years concealing her true identity was about to reveal herself in the most dramatic way possible, by taking on impossible odds to defend her homeland. As Maria's P-51 Mustang climbed into the morning sky, she felt a surge of adrenaline unlike anything she had ever experienced. The familiar controls responded perfectly to her touch, and years of secret practice suddenly crystallized into razor-sharp focus. Below her, the airfield continued to burn, but she forced herself to ignore the destruction and concentrate on the tactical situation unfolding above. The German fighters had completed their second strafing run and were climbing to reform, their attack formation at about 8,000 feet. Maria counted exactly 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s, arranged in 3 flights of 4 aircraft each. She could tell from their precise positioning and coordinated movements that these were veteran pilots, probably members of an elite squadron, with extensive combat experience. Any reasonable person would have turned around and fled, but Maria wasn't thinking like a reasonable person anymore. She was thinking like a combat pilot. Her father's tactical lessons echoed in her mind as she assessed her options. Never engage enemy fighters on their terms, he had always told her. Use surprise, altitude, and speed to your advantage. Make every shot count, because you might not get a second chance. Maria pulled back on the stick and continued climbing, positioning herself between the enemy formation and the sun. The Messerschmitts were focused on the targets below, and hadn't yet noticed the lone American fighter rising to meet them. At 10,000 feet, Maria leveled off and began a wide circling maneuver that would bring her behind the enemy formation. The German pilots were clearly confident in their numerical superiority and weren't bothering to post lookouts or maintain defensive spacing. This overconfidence would be their first mistake. Maria checked her ammunition load one more time. 6 .50 caliber machine guns with enough rounds for about 20 seconds of sustained fire. She would have to make every bullet count. The lead flight of Messerschmitts was beginning another dive toward the airfield when Maria struck. She rolled inverted and dove from above, building speed as she closed the distance to the trailing aircraft in the formation. The German pilot never saw her coming. At a range of just 200 yards, Maria opened fire with a precise burst that caught the Messerschmitt squarely in the engine compartment. Smoke and flames erupted from the enemy fighter as it rolled over and began spiraling toward the ground below. The sudden attack threw the entire German formation into chaos. Radio chatter filled the airwaves as the surviving pilots tried to locate their attacker while simultaneously avoiding collision with their own wingmen. Maria used their confusion to her advantage, pulling up hard and rolling into position behind the second aircraft in the formation. This pilot was more alert and began taking evasive action, but Maria had anticipated his moves and adjusted her aim accordingly. Her second burst of machine gun fire found its mark, sending the Messerschmitt's right wing spinning away in a shower of metal fragments. The crippled aircraft immediately went into an uncontrolled spin, and Maria saw the pilot bail out, his parachute deploying as he drifted away from the battle. 2 down, 10 to go. But now the remaining German pilots knew they were under attack, and they were beginning to respond with the skill and coordination that had made them so dangerous. The lead flight commander's voice cut through the radio static, barking orders in German that Maria couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough. The scattered formation began to regroup, with half the remaining aircraft climbing to gain altitude, while the others turned to engage the unknown American pilot who had appeared seemingly from nowhere. Maria found herself facing 5 Messerschmitts, head-on, with 5 more climbing above her to cut off any escape route. This was exactly the kind of tactical situation her father had prepared her for during their countless hours of theoretical combat training. When outnumbered, never allow the enemy to dictate the terms of engagement, she remembered him saying. Use your aircraft's strengths against their weaknesses, and never stay in one place long enough for them to get a clean shot. The P-51 had superior speed and diving capability compared to the Messerschmitt, and Maria intended to use every advantage she could get. She pushed the stick forward and dove toward the deck, building tremendous speed as the German fighters pursued her. The airfield flashed by below as she skimmed just above the treetops at nearly 400 miles per hour. Behind her, the Messerschmitts were struggling to keep up, their heavier aircraft less suited for high-speed pursuit at low altitude. Maria had successfully split the enemy formation and drawn them away from their planned attack on the airfield. But she knew this tactical advantage wouldn't last long. As she approached a line of hills to the east of the airfield, Maria executed a maneuver she had practiced hundreds of times in her mind but never attempted in reality. She pulled back hard on the stick and performed a climbing barrel roll that brought her up and behind the pursuing German fighters. The sudden reversal caught them completely off guard, and Maria found herself in the perfect position to engage the trailing aircraft in their formation. Her third kill came as the Messerschmitt pilot was still trying to figure out where his target had gone. Maria's gun spoke again, and the enemy fighter disintegrated in a ball of flame and smoke. But there was no time to celebrate. The remaining German pilots were now fully alert to the threat she represented, and they were closing in from multiple directions with murderous intent. The real test of Maria's skills was just beginning. She had successfully engaged the enemy and scored 3 victories, but 9 experienced combat pilots were now focused entirely on shooting her down. The next few minutes would determine whether her years of secret preparation had been enough to prepare her for the ultimate challenge of aerial combat against overwhelming odds. The hidden pilot had revealed herself, but the battle was far from over. The sky above Riverside had become a deadly arena where 9 German fighters circled like sharks around their lone American opponent. Maria's Mustang was now the center of attention for every remaining enemy pilot, and she could see tracer rounds streaking past her cockpit as multiple aircraft tried to line up killing shots. The playful maneuvers she had practiced in secret were now matters of life and death, with split-second timing, determining whether she would survive the next few minutes. The German formation leader had reorganized his remaining aircraft into 2 tactical groups. 4 Messerschmitts positioned themselves above Maria's altitude, ready to dive down on her the moment she tried to climb, while 5 others spread out in a wide circle at her current level, gradually tightening their trap. It was a classic pincer movement designed to eliminate any possibility of escape, and Maria realized she was facing pilots who had probably used this same tactic to shoot down dozens of Allied aircraft over Europe. But Maria had advantages that the German pilots didn't know about. Her intimate knowledge of the local terrain gave her options that weren't available to the enemy fighters. More importantly, her years of studying historical air battles had taught her to recognize standard tactical formations and their weaknesses. The Germans were executing a textbook maneuver, but textbook solutions could be countered by unconventional thinking. She rolled sharply to the right and dove toward a narrow canyon that cut through the hills east of the airfield. The canyon was barely wide enough for a single aircraft, with rocky walls rising hundreds of feet on both sides. It was exactly the kind of terrain feature that most pilots would avoid during combat, but Maria had flown through it dozens of times. During her secret practice sessions, she knew every twist and turn, every wind current and potential hazard. The pursuing Messerschmitts followed her into the canyon, but their formation immediately began to break apart. The narrow space prevented them from maintaining their coordinated attack pattern, and they were forced to string out in single file behind her. This was exactly what Maria had hoped for. She had turned a disadvantageous many-against-one situation into a series of individual duels, where her superior knowledge of the terrain would be decisive. As she flashed through the canyon at maximum Speed. Maria suddenly pulled up in a climbing turn that took her over the canyon rim and back into open sky. The first German pilot, caught off guard by her sudden maneuver, tried to follow but clipped his wing on the canyon wall. His aircraft cartwheeled into the rocks below in a spectacular explosion that temporarily blinded the pilots behind him. The second Messerschmitt made it out of the canyon but found itself alone and exposed, with Maria already positioning herself for another attack. This pilot was skilled and immediately began defensive maneuvers, rolling and weaving to avoid her guns. But Maria had studied German fighter tactics extensively, and she could anticipate his moves before he made them. When he rolled left, she was already there waiting. When he tried to climb away, she had already calculated his escape route. Her fourth kill came after a brief but intense dogfight that lasted less than 90 seconds. The German pilot fought bravely, but Maria's combination of tactical knowledge and superior aircraft performance proved decisive. Her machine guns found their mark, and another Messerschmitt spiraled earthward, trailing smoke and flames. The odds were slowly improving, but 7 enemy fighters still remained, and Maria could feel fatigue beginning to affect her reaction times. The remaining German pilots had learned to respect their mysterious opponent, and they were no longer making the tactical mistakes that had cost them their first 4 aircraft. The formation leader was directing his surviving pilots with increasing caution, keeping them in mutually supporting pairs and refusing to be drawn into the kind of individual combat where Maria held the advantage. Maria realized she needed to change her tactics. The Germans were now fighting defensively, waiting for her to make a mistake or run low on fuel and ammunition. She couldn't afford to let the battle drag on much longer. Her fuel gauge was showing less than half capacity, and she had already expended significant ammunition in her previous engagements. She needed to end this fight quickly, which meant taking calculated risks that could either secure victory or result in her immediate destruction. She spotted her opportunity when 2 of the Messerschmitts made a coordinated attack run on her position. Instead of evading as they expected, Maria turned directly toward them in a head-on pass that would bring all 3 aircraft together at a combined speed of nearly 700 miles per hour. It was an incredibly dangerous maneuver that left no room for error. If she miscalculated by even a fraction of a second, all 3 planes would be destroyed in a collision. The 2 German pilots, apparently thinking Maria had lost her nerve or made a fatal error in judgment, held their course and opened fire. Tracer rounds filled the air between the converging aircraft as all 3 pilots fought to line up their shots in the few seconds they had before impact. Maria waited until the last possible moment, then rolled inverted and dove beneath the converging Messerschmitts while firing a sustained burst upward into their flight path. Both German fighters flew directly into her stream of machine gun fire. The first aircraft exploded instantly, while the second caught fire and began an uncontrolled descent toward the ground below. Maria had scored a double victory in one pass, but the maneuver had cost her precious altitude and left her vulnerable to attack from the remaining 5 enemy fighters that were diving down from above. As she pulled out of her dive and began climbing back toward the main battle, Maria could see that the German pilots were becoming more desperate and aggressive. They had started the engagement with overwhelming numerical superiority, but now they found themselves facing an opponent who had already shot down 6 of their comrades in just 15 minutes of combat. The hunter had become the hunted, and the remaining enemy pilots knew that their survival depended on eliminating this dangerous American pilot before she could claim any more victories. With only 5 German fighters remaining, the aerial battle above Riverside entered its most desperate and dangerous phase. Maria's fuel gauge showed less than 30 minutes of flying time left, and her ammunition counter indicated she had fired nearly 60% of her machine gun rounds. Every remaining bullet would have to count if she hoped to complete the impossible task she had set for herself when she first took off from the burning airfield below. The surviving Messerschmitt pilots had abandoned their earlier tactical discipline and were now attacking with the fury of cornered animals. They came at Maria from multiple directions simultaneously, their machine guns and cannons filling the sky with deadly crossfire. She found herself constantly maneuvering to avoid collisions, while searching for opportunities to line up her own shots. The stress of continuous combat was taking its toll, and she could feel her reactions becoming slightly slower as fatigue began to set in. Maria executed a sharp climbing turn that brought her above the enemy formation. But this time the Germans were ready for her altitude advantage. As she rolled into her attack dive, tracer rounds began streaking past her cockpit from 3 different directions. She was forced to break off her attack and dive away, pulling negative G-forces that pressed her hard against her safety harness. A line of bullet holes appeared along her right wing, and she could smell the acrid odor of damaged electrical systems. The German formation leader was proving to be an exceptionally skilled pilot who had learned from the mistakes of his fallen comrades. He was keeping his remaining aircraft in tight formation while directing coordinated attacks that left Maria with fewer opportunities to engage individual targets. Each time she tried to isolate one enemy fighter, the others would converge on her position, forcing her to abandon her attack and seek defensive maneuvers. But Maria still had one significant advantage: her intimate knowledge of the local area and weather patterns. She had noticed that morning cloud formations were beginning to develop along the mountain ridges, creating patches of limited visibility that could provide concealment for tactical repositioning. If she could draw the enemy fighters into these cloud banks, she might be able to even the odds by forcing them back into individual combat situations. She turned toward the mountains and began a climbing spiral that would take her into the developing cloud cover. The Messerschmitts followed, maintaining their tight formation as they pursued her upward through the thickening mist. At 12,000 feet, visibility dropped to less than 100 yards, and the precise coordination that had made the German formation so dangerous became impossible to maintain. In the gray twilight world of the clouds, Maria's superior familiarity with her aircraft became decisive. She could fly her Mustang by instinct alone, feeling the subtle changes in airflow and engine response that told her exactly where she was and what her aircraft was doing. The German pilots, flying unfamiliar aircraft in unfamiliar territory, were forced to rely more heavily on their instruments and could no longer maintain visual contact with each other. Maria used the limited visibility to her advantage, making sudden course changes that allowed her to emerge from the clouds behind unsuspecting targets. Her 7th kill came as she surprised a Messerschmitt pilot who was struggling to maintain formation in the thick mist. The enemy fighter never saw her coming, and her machine gun sent it spinning out of the clouds in flames. 4 enemy aircraft remained. The cloud cover was beginning to thin as the morning sun climbed higher, and Maria knew she had only a few more minutes before the visibility would improve enough to allow the Germans to regroup. She had to act quickly to eliminate as many opponents as possible, while the tactical advantage remained in her favor. Her fuel situation was becoming critical. She estimated less than 15 minutes of flying time remained. She spotted 2 Messerschmitts flying in close formation just below the cloud base and decided to attempt another high-risk maneuver. Rolling inverted, she dove straight down through the clouds, building tremendous speed as she fell toward the unsuspecting enemy fighters. At the last possible moment, she pulled out of her dive and fired a long burst that caught both aircraft in her gun sight simultaneously. The results were devastating. Both Messerschmitts were hit repeatedly by her .50 caliber rounds, and one exploded instantly while the other began streaming fire and smoke as it spiraled toward the ground. Maria had scored her 8th and 9th victories in a single pass, but the violent maneuver had brought her dangerously close to the ground, and she found herself trapped below the remaining enemy fighters with limited room to maneuver. The last 3 German pilots realized that their mysterious opponent was running low on fuel and ammunition, and they pressed their attack with renewed determination. They came at her from 3 different angles, forcing her into increasingly desperate evasive maneuvers as she tried to avoid their converging fire. Machine gun bullets shattered her cockpit canopy, and hydraulic fluid began leaking from damaged control systems. But Maria still had one final card to play. During her years of secret flying, she had discovered a narrow pass through the mountains that required precise navigation and split-second timing to traverse safely. It was exactly the kind of terrain feature that could turn a desperate retreat into a tactical opportunity. She pointed her damaged Mustang toward the mountain pass and pushed her throttles to maximum power. The 3 pursuing Messerschmitts followed her into the pass, their pilots confident that they finally had their elusive target trapped with nowhere to run. But as they entered the narrow canyon, Maria suddenly executed a maneuver that none of them expected. She pulled straight up in a vertical climb that took her over the canyon rim, while the enemy fighters were still committed to flying through the pass. From her position above the canyon, Maria had perfect shots at all three remaining German fighters as they flew beneath her in single file. Her machine guns spoke for the final time, sending accurate bursts into each enemy aircraft in rapid succession. Within seconds, all three Messerschmitts were burning wrecks scattered across the canyon floor below. The sky above Riverside was suddenly, eerily quiet. In just 20 minutes of the most intense aerial combat imaginable, Maria had accomplished something that military historians would later call impossible. A single pilot had engaged and destroyed 12 enemy fighters without sustaining a single loss on her own side. As she turned her damaged Mustang back toward the airfield, Maria realized that her secret was out forever. But she had saved countless lives and protected her homeland from a devastating attack that could have changed the course of the war. As Maria's battle-damaged Mustang approached Riverside Airfield, she could see crowds of people gathering along the runway, despite the smoke still rising from the earlier attack. Word had spread quickly through the small town that a single American pilot had engaged an entire squadron of enemy fighters and emerged victorious. Nobody knew yet who had performed this incredible feat of aerial combat, but everyone wanted to witness the return of the mysterious hero who had saved their community from complete destruction. Maria's hands trembled slightly as she lined up for her final approach. The adrenaline that had sustained her through 20 minutes of life-and-death combat was beginning to wear off, and she was suddenly aware of just how close she had come to being shot down multiple times during the battle. Her aircraft showed the scars of the engagement, bullet holes in the wings, a shattered canopy, and warning lights indicating multiple system failures. But the engine was still running smoothly, and the controls responded adequately for a safe landing. Colonel Mitchell stood at the edge of the runway with a pair of binoculars, trying to identify the pilot of the approaching fighter. He had watched most of the aerial battle from the ground and could hardly believe what he had witnessed. 12 enemy aircraft had been systematically destroyed by a single pilot displaying tactical skills and combat instincts that surpassed anything he had seen in 2 decades of military service. Whoever was flying that Mustang was either the luckiest pilot alive or one of the most naturally gifted combat aviators in aviation history. As the P-51 touched down and rolled to a stop, Maria sat in the cockpit for a long moment, gathering her thoughts and preparing for what she knew would be a life-changing conversation. Through her damaged canopy, she could see Tom Richardson and dozens of other people running toward her aircraft, their faces filled with excitement and curiosity. There was no way to hide anymore. Her 3 years of maintaining a secret identity were about to come to an abrupt end. She shut down the engine and began removing her flight helmet as the first spectators reached her aircraft. Tom was among the first to arrive, and his expression changed from excitement to complete shock as he realized who was sitting in the pilot's seat. "Maria?" he whispered, as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. "Maria, is that really you?" She nodded silently, then began the process of unbuckling her safety harness and climbing out of the cockpit. The crowd fell silent as Maria emerged from the aircraft, her hair disheveled and her flight suit stained with hydraulic fluid and smoke residue. Colonel Mitchell pushed through the gathering crowd, his face showing a mixture of amazement and confusion as he tried to process what he was seeing. The mysterious pilot who had just performed the most remarkable feat of aerial combat he had ever witnessed was the quiet mechanic who had been working at his airfield for the past 3 years. "Miss Santos," the colonel said formally, struggling to find the right words, "I believe you have some explaining to do." Maria straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir, I do," she replied. "But first, I need to report that all 12 enemy aircraft have been destroyed. The immediate threat to the airfield and the surrounding community has been eliminated." Her voice was steady and professional, showing no trace of the emotional turmoil she was feeling inside. Over the next hour, as emergency crews worked to extinguish the remaining fires and assess the damage to the airfield, Maria found herself at the center of an impromptu interrogation. Colonel Mitchell, still trying to understand how his mechanic had secretly become one of the most skilled combat pilots he had ever encountered, listened with growing amazement as she explained her background and training. The story of her father's instruction, her years of secret practice, and her intimate knowledge of aircraft systems painted a picture of dedication and skill that impressed even the most skeptical observers. Tom Richardson, who had worked alongside Maria for 3 years without ever suspecting her true capabilities, kept shaking his head in disbelief. "I can't believe it," he muttered repeatedly. "All this time, you were right there, and none of us knew what you could do." Maria smiled wearily and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I never wanted to deceive anyone," she said. "But the rules didn't allow women to serve as combat pilots, so I did what I had to do to stay close to aviation." As news of the battle spread beyond the confines of the airfield, reporters and military officials began arriving to investigate the incredible story of the female pilot who had single-handedly defeated an enemy squadron. Within hours, Maria's photograph was being transmitted across the country, and her story was featured in newspapers from coast to coast. The young woman who had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight had suddenly become one of the most famous people in America. Colonel Mitchell, after consulting with his superiors, made a decision that would change military policy forever. "Miss Santos," he said formally, "I am authorized to offer you an immediate commission as a lieutenant in the United States Army Air Forces. Your demonstrated skill and courage have more than qualified you for active duty as a combat pilot." Maria accepted the commission without hesitation, finally able to serve her country openly and honestly. The attack on Riverside Airfield was later determined to have been launched from a German submarine that had somehow penetrated American coastal defenses. Intelligence analysts concluded that the enemy had intended to establish a forward operating base for further attacks on West Coast installations. Maria's intervention had not only saved her local community, but had potentially prevented a much larger strategic disaster that could have changed the entire course of the war. In the months that followed, Lieutenant Maria Santos became a symbol of courage and determination for women across America. Her story inspired thousands of other women to pursue careers in aviation, and military policies regarding female combat pilots began to change as a direct result of her extraordinary performance. She went on to serve with distinction in the Pacific Theater, shooting down an additional 8 enemy aircraft and earning multiple decorations for valor. Years later, when military historians studied the Battle of Riverside Airfield, they would conclude that Maria's victory represented one of the most remarkable individual achievements in the history of aerial warfare. Against overwhelming odds, with no backup and no support, she had demonstrated that skill, determination, and courage could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The young woman who had once hidden her talents in the shadows had become a legend whose story would inspire future generations of pilots. But for Maria herself, the most important outcome of that October morning was much simpler. She had finally been able to use her gifts openly and honestly in service to her country. The 3 years of hiding and pretending were over, and she could now fly with the pride and recognition that her abilities had always deserved. The secret: pilot had become a hero, but more importantly, she had become free to be exactly who she was meant to be. As the sun set on that historic day, Maria stood on the repaired runway at Riverside Airfield, watching new student pilots practice their maneuvers in the evening light. Some of them were women, inspired by her example to pursue their own dreams of flight. She smiled as she watched them learn, knowing that they would never have to hide their abilities or pretend to be something less than they were. The barrier had been broken, and the sky was now truly open to everyone with the courage and skill to claim it.